And we are back here at the Antidote with James Perloff, back for the second part of our interview here. And just before we took a little break, you were discussing the certainly very interesting, what appears to be in a lot of ways perhaps some hidden history with Thomas Paine and Thomas Jefferson and some of the machinations around the writing of the Declaration of Independence and how that may have fit into the American Revolution in general. And I think this correlates, Jeremy, with some of the research we've stumbled upon that we've covered on some of our shows about the B'nai B'rith in the American Civil War. And of course, the B'nai B'rith is pretty much an offshoot of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, where you had heavy Jewish B'nai B'rith involvement in the Confederacy during the American Civil War, people such as Judah Benjamin, and also, of course, the infamous Albert Pike, who wrote so many Masonic texts, particularly obviously wrote about the three world wars, and just the influence within the Confederacy of that, and just how Masonic fingerprints were all over the American Civil War, and even extending into a lot of the organizations that are most influential in our society, everything from the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith to even its so-called the extreme type of organizations that the ADL is said to be devoted to exposing, and such as the Ku Klux Klan. There does appear to be a Scottish Rite Freemasonry, B'nai B'rith origins, all that with the American Revolution. And anybody who wants to know more about that could listen to our shows, as well as the research that the late William Cooper did on B'nai B'rith, as well as the LaRouche organization and their extensive research into B'nai B'rith and its history going from the American Civil War to present times. So that really, I think, very much corroborates with, or it very much fits into a lot of other historical angles. And of course, there's also the element of the revolution. I mean, the revolutions throughout history, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. You're referring to the revolutions that basically toppled the old European monarchies, such as the 1848 year of revolution, the Russian Revolution. And you could almost count the American Civil War in that vein, and also, or the American Revolutionary War, and also even the American Civil War, where we were given entirely false pretenses, almost being sort of a counter, also, or maybe even an addendum to the American Revolution, so to speak. And so it's very interesting from that regard, but I would definitely advise people to certainly keep an open mind on this information and definitely look into all of this. And I'm glad you shared that with us, James.
Yeah, well, if you look at Satan as the head of the New World Order, establishment people come and go, they die, but Satan's got a long-term outlook, and I think that's why we see such a continuity of the process, as if these guys had foresight when they, when they founded the Fed, that they would know that it was the kind of shenanigans that are going on today. But this was all done as part, I believe, certainly a long-term agenda that has definitely been unfolding here in the West for a long time.
Yes, and Greg, as you spoke about this background of the founding of B'nai B'rith, and it's actually like right before the Civil War, you have this founding of the Judeo-Masonic B'nai B'rith Lodge, and then key players in that organization in the Confederacy, and then one Simon Wolf, who is ultimately becomes the head of B'nai B'rith. He is implicated in some of the surrounding events, including apparently meeting with John Wilkes Booth in the morning of the assassination of Lincoln in the theater. But then you see him also span the gap into the early 20th century, where I believe he is a key advocate or lobbyist in many ways in relationship to Teddy Roosevelt, I think, in terms of the burgeoning revolution coming and being built in many ways, financed out of Wall Street in terms of the Bolshevik revolution. So I'm interested in that sort of that time frame, and then maybe the Scofield Bible as part and parcel of that. So you see, again, once again, in a certain way, in a like what you would see in a Christian context, controlled dialectic. In this Jewish context that Greg mentioned before from Winston Churchill in terms of Zionism and Bolshevism, there seems to be some commonality in terms of not only temporally, but even maybe some of the figures here.
Definitely, you have the Rothschilds as backers through the Kuhn Loeb banking house, Jacob Schiff and Paul Warburg financing Trotsky, and you've got Paul Warburg's brother Max arranging for Lenin to come into Russia on that's a famous blacked out train with gold. So I'm fascinated about some of these things you've been saying that I hadn't even heard of this guy Simon Wolf meeting with John Wilkes Booth before, or heard that he had a long-term career. So I'd like to be looking up some of that. I'll probably be doing some search terming myself after the show is over to look into some of the stuff you guys have been talking about. Quite fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I wanted to take the conversation back to during the first part. We did talk. You talked about such things as Trump's Zionism and things such as, of course, the Kushners and the Chabad connection, as well as the invocation at the inauguration by the Jewish Rabbi Marvin Heyer, who I believe may have been the head of the Simon Wiesenthal Center for a period of time.
Correct. That is correct. Yeah.
Okay. I think that's very important, and that is, I think that's rather significant, obviously. But when I think about this, I do more and more, and I would say that our friend Adam Green, who is No More News on YouTube, he's really for us at least, and there's other people as well, obviously doing this work. Very interesting that Chuck Baldwin has turned against Christian Zionism and has even endorsed Christopher Berlin's 9/11 research. I think that's very significant. But our friend Adam Green, among others, has really talked about the importance of this third temple prophecy, which seems to be the driving force for a lot of this evangelical. Actually, my friend Brad sent me an email, a regular listener, saying that we should refer to it as Scofield Zionism rather than Christian Zionism. I think that might be more accurate in a lot of ways. But you see this just this yearning, this hardcore yearning for things such as this temple to be rebuilt. And Adam has surmised that perhaps the embassy is a symbolic gesture that is actually really about the temple rather so much as the embassy. The embassy was a symbolic move for a lot of these messianic religious figures, both Christian and Jewish. And so you think about this, though, and there is a lot of messianic fervor around Trump. You look at websites such as WorldNet Daily, run by Joseph Farah, who was won an award from the Zionist Organization of America, and other websites that have popped up. I mean, Breitbart, which has bragged of being conceived in Israel at a table. Andrew Breitbart and the head of the Gateway Pundit at a table with Benjamin Netanyahu in 2007. Breitbart made an America conceived in Israel. There were articles popping up around the time of the election of the messages, the symbolism from a religious Jewish kind of Zionist perspective of what the presidency of Donald Trump means. And so I think that when we go back to like a lot of these neocons, the Bill Kristol type of wing, I don't think that they're into all of this this real apocalyptic fervor about the end times, and kind of hurrying about this false interpretation of the end of the world as documented in the Book of Revelation and the how things are going to play out at the end times. It's like they're trying to bring it about. And also another very underreported I think very significant factor about Trump is that Trump had more support from Christian or Scofield Zionists than any other president in American history. More evangelical Christians voted for Trump than for Ronald Reagan even, or George W. Bush. And you've seen pretty much all of the major kind of evangelical televangelist prosperity gospel, which I think in a lot of ways goes hand in hand with the Zionism. I think just probably because of the inherent corruption of prosperity type preaching and all that. And but everyone from Jerry Falwell Jr. I think was one of the very first major evangelical leaders to endorse Donald Trump. And of course, his father was such a hardcore Zionist to the point he was awarded a personal jet by Prime Minister Menachem Begin. You have people such as the disgraced Jim Baker, who was in prison in the 80s for fleecing his Praise the Lord flock. He's back selling end times, combined with making money off of what I believe are very gullible people down in Branson, Missouri. And you've got a lot of this, and there is a Christian kind of even Jewish, very, I think, continuity in terms of promoting all of this stuff with the temple, and even InfoWars is hosted this apocalyptic Zionist who's talked about the third temple live on air, and I think that's very important because you've gotten the entire conspiracy-oriented, a lot of the conspiracy-oriented element of the population behind Trump via sites such as InfoWars, which I think have people such as Jerome Corsi and Roger Stone being at the forefront of that operation now, I think is very important. But I do see this significant messianic fervor, and it has to do with greater Israel and also with bringing about the end times. And of course, the other underreported aspect of this is someone like Sheldon Adelson giving $50 million to Trump in the last months of the run up to the election, and the promises from Steve Bannon, which were very underreported out of that book by Joshua Green, Michael Wolff, about the Trump White House fire and fury, which resulted in Bannon being dismissed from the White House. Something that was put in there was all of this talk, Bannon promising, basically almost making a pact with Sheldon Adelson and some other very prominent Zionists that we will move the embassy in the first day of the day after the inauguration, and forming this alliance between Israel and bringing Israel closer to countries such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I think effectively moving Saudi Arabia out of this more Atlanticist kind of foreign policy establishment that we've known, and moving it more into a strictly hardcore, more of a hard Zionist direction with basically the coup in Saudi Arabia. So there's so much here, but I do think this is very important. And James, we would like for you to shed some light on your thoughts on this and how much of a driving force this might be, and also you could tie in some of the history behind the false doctrine of Christian Zionism, perhaps where it truly originated from.
Right, and the main pivot point for changing Christian views and getting them to support Israel and making them think that the established state of Israel was a prophesied event that they needed to support was indeed a book you've already mentioned, the Scofield Reference Bible. So we should probably touch on that. Cyrus Scofield was a very crooked Kansas politician. He abandoned his wife and children. He was involved in numerous confidence games. He disappeared for a while up in Canada and resurfaced in St. Louis. And he got in trouble there with more forgeries and confidence games, and his sister was trying to bail him out. And then all of a sudden the charges against him were dropped. And this is all written about in a book by Joseph Canfield. It's the Amazing Scofield in his book. It's probably certainly the most thorough biography of Scofield. But he all of a sudden became a minister and was involved in the teachings of, became a follower of the teachings of John Darby, who was preaching this idea of a rapture. And John Darby was a Freemason, a Satanist, and he actually wrote a satanic version of the Bible. And I have an article called the Abomination of Christian Zionism, which goes into the whole history of this and links to that Bible and analyses of it. But the rapture, of course, which is a very hotly debated topic in Christian circles today, evangelical circles, basically predicted that Jesus is going to come back not one time, two times. He'll come back first for the rapture, and then he'll come back for a major second event, coming event, which is not something the Bible talks about at all. Two returns of Christ. But basically, in a nutshell, the reason that the idea of the rapture was introduced was to make Christians think that they would not face any persecution from this growing world government, New World Order, and therefore they didn't need to oppose it because they're going to be raptured out of the world while the rest of the world is suffering. But it was Cyrus Scofield who really he wrote the Reference Bible that was printed in millions of copies that indoctrinated Christians with this idea and really birthed Christian Zionism, with, of course, many seminaries then being funded by Rockefellers or proxies of the Rothschilds. And what had happened was, Theodor Herzl had been hosting these Zionist conferences in Switzerland, Basel, Switzerland, and the idea was the Jews would take over Palestine, which is where we see so much of the trouble of the world emanating from today. And but the Zionists knew they would need the support of the Christian community, which was divided into Catholic and Protestant, of course, essentially in the West. And so Herzl, in January of 1904, went to visit Pope Pius X and asked his blessing on the Jews taking over the land of Palestine and the Zionist project. And the Pope said we could not endorse any such thing. And having been rejected by the Vatican, it now became absolutely essential to persuade the Protestants. And so I believe it's really no coincidence that right after that rejection, that Cyrus Scofield, who'd become a member of the exclusive Lotos Club of New York, this is a place where people like Margaret Mead and the head of the New York Times and Mark Twain, and this is not a place where you find an evangelical Christian, but you have these evangelical Christian pastor named Cyrus Scofield approved to enter the club by none other than Samuel Untermeyer, who was the leading Zionist in America during the 20th century. It's fair to say he was behind the Jewish declaration of war on Germany in 1933, helped draft the Federal Reserve Act. He was the man who blackmailed Woodrow Wilson into putting Louis Brandeis on the Supreme Court. His history just goes way back in Zionist efforts, and he approved Scofield getting onto that into the club. And then in 1904, Scofield makes a trip to England. He meets a person there who Scofield, according to the official biography, says, well, I just don't know who would publish my reference Bible that I'm planning to write, and wouldn't it was such a fortunate thing. His friend just happened to know the head of Oxford University Press, which is run by Zionists and socialists who had absolutely no interest in Christianity, but he went there and received immediate upfront approval that, yes, you write your reference Bible in Oxford University Press, which didn't publish Bibles, by the way, normally, was assured him of a contract. And this is ridiculous because, as ridiculous as entering the Lotus Club, because, no publishing house gives you upfront guarantee or approval if you have never written a book before. He'd never written a book before. He'd written a pamphlet called Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth, which was printed as a book. But they're not going to make that kind of offering to this man. He has absolutely no university or seminary training. He's not qualified. He doesn't know any of the ancient languages the Bible is written in. But within 5 years, he had this reference Bible ready for publication. Oxford University Press published it. But the main edition, you can't find that 1909, the original 1909 edition today, but the main edition came out in 1917. That was the one that was hyper-marketed. And 1917 was, of course, the year of the Balfour Declaration. So it made it appear that this Bible, which had his notes, which had obviously been dictated to him right on the pages, which were talking about how the Bible prophesies that the Jews must return to Israel and that God's given them land as an unconditional promise. And anybody who knows the Bible, the Old Testament, knows that God's promises to the Jews were always conditional on their obedience. And it was not God leading the Jews into Palestine and creating that state in 1948. It was a Rothschild endeavor for sure. Nothing to do with the Rothschilds had also slaughtered millions of Christians via the Bolsheviks in the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. All this was going on at the same time. In any event, it was that book, published with millions of copies by Oxford, that birthed and taught in seminaries, and that taught Christians that the Jews never had their, they were told that the conquest of Palestine by Joshua was never completed, so it had to be fulfilled in the 20th century. And that actually contradicts the Bible itself. Joshua 21:43, we read, and the Lord gave unto Israel all the land which he sware to give unto their fathers, and they possessed it and dwelt therein. And the Lord gave them rest round about according to all that he swore to their fathers. And there stood not a man of their enemies before them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. There failed not aught of any good thing which the Lord had spoken unto the house of Israel. All came to pass." Unquote. That the prophecies to Joshua had been fulfilled. This idea that he had to go back and slaughter the Palestinians, the Zionists, to go back and slaughter the Palestinians, and Christians to support that was an absurdity. But that's what happened beginning in 1948 with the NABCA, and it was therein that the gradual erosion of Palestinian rights began, that the terrorist acts of the Israelis began, the Irgun, with the Irgun, of course, the King David hotel bombing, the Levant affair, the attack on the USS Liberty, La Belle Discotheque, leading up to 9/11, which, we won't go into all the, details that show people associated with Israel, including ones you've already mentioned in this broadcast, being tied to 9/11. But that was kind of the foundation of changing Christian thinking, whereas, a couple hundred years ago, the idea that Jews exclusively should have control of Jerusalem, that would have been anathema to Christians. But boiling the frog and using the Scofield Reference Bible, they gradually turned the tide of thought in the evangelical community.
Wow.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeremy. You want to go ahead?
No, go for it, Greg.
Okay. No, yeah, I'm glad you brought all this up and that history there. And in fact, a primary reason, perhaps the primary reason for America entering the First World War was the Balfour Declaration, and people like Untermeyer and pressure put on Woodrow Wilson from those circles. Woodrow Wilson was the man who delivered the Federal Reserve Act and also brought America the income tax and also the First World War, which he later said, that he unwittingly betrayed his country about. I don't know how sincere he was, but he did write that in his final days. But this is all very important history here, and this is a continuing project. And so I think that someone like Donald Trump and the movement behind him is aligned, and I do think that you've got this, you do have this post-World War II order, so to speak, that is dedicated, that is devoted. Obviously, a major function of it is defending Israel in its current form and all that. And obviously, that Congress is captive to organizations such as AIPAC. But also, I do think that most of the American foreign policy establishment is not, as well as a lot of the European foreign policy establishment with entities such as NATO, the European Union, are not into all of this religious type of yearning and for all of this. And I think that's a major point there. And I think that a lot of these right-wing Zionists in both Israel and in the West are hedging their bets on this populist Western movement that goes beyond Trump. It's also things such as Brexit. It's things such as Viktor Orban in Hungary, the new government in Italy, and also perhaps at some level, perhaps, and I'm open to different interpretations on this, perhaps even Russia fits into that at a level. But, that's another conversation for another time. But I do think that they've hedged their bets on this because I feel like this is where they're going to get their goals. And also you can hold on to the portion of the population that is conservative leaning, that is losing faith in their government. I mean, you saw the Tea Party was all about losing faith in government. It was equally critical of Bush-type Republicans as well as the left. And now they're just all back into this Republican fold. It's just Trump people are just people who used to be very critical of the entire political system. Alex Jones and InfoWars are pushing that we need to vote for the Republicans and we need to vote for the GOP to save Trump. And there's this, and so I think that even people like McCain, for example, I think that McCain is probably at the end of the day is horrible as he is in so many ways. I think at the end of the day he might be closely aligned with this faction that is about maintaining, the U.S. military's global might, as opposed to this religious-based yearning for the fulfillment of the Zionist, Zionist project. And real quick before I'll stop talking here, but I do think this is extremely important, and so it's important for people to look at this from that regard. And there's not a lot of people that are shedding any light on this, so I'm very glad we're able to have this conversation, James, with you about all of this. And I think it's vitally important because hardcore Zionist fingerprints are all over Donald Trump, from the networks within the right-wing Zionist media that have been in activism circles that have been out to expose the Clintons for the past 30 years, going back to the Richard Mellon Scaife media empire, and also a huge obviously Israeli right-wing Israeli influence via sites such as Breitbart, which was through the Mercer family and Bannon and their whole network. Was responsible for the book Clinton Cash, and then you've even got the Info Wars and perhaps Gateway pundits are pushing the more conspiratorial type of deals about the Clintons. And of course, that's not to say it's all not true, but I mean, this is very much a very Jewish, very Zionist, right-wing Zionist project in so many ways. And I do think Trump is the most Zionist president in American history, and I think this figures into Iran because the last administration obviously was very much not a fan of. I don't think that Obama administration was really devoted to any type of like real hawkish action on Iran. I mean, it's to the point that you had Black Cube, this Israeli firm, went and dug up dirt and attempted to, was stalking basically these Obama administration officials who were behind the Iran deal, the same firm that Harvey Weinstein used against his victims, and also that Hungary's Viktor Orban used for opponents of Hungary's immigration policy, the same Israeli-based firms. So I think that also another factor of this is the Iranian element. And it's hard to say what's going on because I know you've written in the New American back in 2009 about facets of the Iranian Revolution which are not widely talked about within alternative media, which has this very rosy view of the Iranian Revolution and the greatness of it. And so we want to go in that direction and get into the Iranian element of this, what you might think is going on with Iran now, and also some of the history of this.
Yeah, it's very well known in alt media that, in fact, I just read a post today by Ron Paul about this, about the history of how the CIA took down Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a popularly elected leader in 1953, because he was planning to nationalize oil in Iran. It's a very big country. It's 4 times the size of Iraq. And a lot of people today have the perception that the Shah, who was installed after that, was just a Western puppet, and actually Ron Paul's language reflected the same thinking, that it was entirely a popular revolution that overthrew him. And I very much disagree with that. The fact is that we'll be friends with you today and we'll wipe you out tomorrow is standard for American foreign policy. Just look at Saddam Hussein. We're backing him in the 80s, and then we invaded him, attacked in 91, and we took him out finally with the war beginning in 2003. I recently had an article on my website called "A Syrian Christian Reveals What's Really Happened in Syria." And this is a Syrian lady, and she told me, and this is not a Syrian girl, it's somebody that I know. One thing she said was that everybody in the entire Syria, not only Syria, but in the entire Middle East, knows that America can be your friend one day and stab you in the back the next. And it's very clear. It's happened time after time. People were always making the good guy into the bad guy and back into the good guy again. You look at Russia, they were the good guys during World War II, and then they became the evil bad guys, and then Gorbachev comes along and they're the good guys, and then Putin comes along, they're the bad guys. And it just depends on the particular epoch and what the necessities are, perceived necessities of change are by the powers that be. But the Shah was favored in 1953, but in the mid 1970s, and I read this in a rare book called The Last Shah of Iran by one of his cabinet officials named Navahandi. I got it from an Iranian bookstore in Los Angeles. And he talked in depth about what was really going on behind the scenes. And he said it was Henry Kissinger who broached the idea that the Shah must go. This is around 1974. Now, the Shah was planning to nationalize oil, the exact same thing that Mossadegh had done. And the Shah was actually, he really upgraded Iran. They had, when he fell, there were more foreign students in America from Iran than any other country in the world. He was modernizing. They had full employment, no inflation. They had to hire foreign workers to come in. He was building an Olympic stadium. He wanted to host the Olympics. And when did you ever have a Middle Eastern country doing that? He was opposed to all drug trade. There was freedom of religion for Christians, Muslims, and whatever your sect was, whatever your belief was, that was tolerated. It was a secular state like Syria today. It was extremely prosperous, and it was creating stability in the Middle East. And but he had done some things that ticked people off. Besides wanting to nationalize the oil industry and take it away from the big oil companies, he He'd also supported Egypt during the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which ticked off the Zionists. But I think really this is the main trigger point. He did an interview with Mike Wallace in the mid-'70s. You can find that on YouTube very easily, where he said that American politics and the American president are controlled by Zionist Jews, and that really, Mike Wallace was just, outraged and kept denouncing that and saying it was unbelievable. And the Shah insisted, and I think that interview had a lot to do with the final downfall. And you see there was continuity between Gerald Ford and Henry Kissinger and the Carter administration. And I can remember clearly, I was watching reading the mainstream media news then. All the mainstream media was railing against the Shah as a terrible tyrant. This just came out of the blue. Ted Kennedy formed a special committee on human rights in Iran, and Jimmy Carter was doing everything he could to take him down. The State Department, the CIA. Khomeini was brought out of Iraq and housed in France, making broadcasts to Iran with protection from the CIA and MI6 and Israeli forces as well. I mean, everybody was arrayed against the Shah. They wanted him to go. And when he finally left, he wrote a book about it, by the way, himself, which is very revelatory about what had happened and all the pressure that was put on him. We even sent a General Robert Heiser to Iran, who told the Iranian generals not to support the Shah, or they would face a break in relations with America. And when Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, he actually put more people to death in his first month than had been killed under the Shah in 38 years. And he executed 1,200 officers of the Iranian armed forces. And that was a brutal beginning for Iran. I consider it the first step of the Arab Spring, really the first step of destabilizing the Middle East. But I should also mention that it's a complex situation. There are many, Iran, I think Iran is a great country. I love Press TV and the stuff that they put out. There are many good people in Iran. There are people who go there to volunteer to fight against ISIS in Syria because the Syrian ranks have been depleted by that 8-year war. There's lots of good people there. The situation is complex. I've heard from people who have been in Iran, who have lived in Iran, who are now in exile, and they say that you have a situation there where you have many people who are truly believers in the Iranian Revolution, but there's also people who do backdoor deals with the United States and Israel who are corrupt. And it's not, again, it's not a situation you can look at and say it's black and white, these are the guys or the bad guys. But one thing is clear is that Donald Trump, I mentioned earlier, on the day of his inauguration, he talked about a missile shield against Iran. And the very moment that Benjamin Netanyahu had that stupid display where he took this curtain off of all these hard drives, which it could have gone on one thumb drive, but he wanted to show that Iran lied. And he didn't actually provide any proof that they were developing nuclear weapons, but he just made a big show with a PowerPoint and all these graphics, And then right after that, Trump said, oh, well, we have to break the deal with Iran. And it's very clear that taking out Iran is part of this religious Zionist hyper ambition to create greater Israel, and that Trump is totally on board with it. He's totally on board with Netanyahu and their plans. So, they definitely have targeted Iran, and we've been hot and cold towards Iran there. The situation is complex, but definitely American foreign policy and Israel are clearly targeting it as an enemy that needs to be disposed of. I don't think that they want a war with Iran. Again, it's 4 times bigger than Iraq, and you know how that war turned out. I think what they want to do is destabilize it from within by promoting more coups, and eventually, the Yinon plan of Israel calls for their neighbors to be Balkanized and divided up. And I think that if they can do that with Syria, then they would make Iran the final target for that kind of thing. They've already seen a couple of attempted uprisings in Iran, which have fallen short. But I think that's certainly an objective of the Greater Israel plans is to destabilize Iran. And once that happened, I feel that the Rothschilds and Benjamin Netanyahu would have no further use for America, and they'd happily see the dollar collapse and America collapse.
And before we maybe get into the potential of what is the threat of what could be delivered in terms of what you just described, which we might even be able to describe as an axis from the city of London as the sort of the epicenter of Rothschild weaponized currency, down to Tel Aviv and now I guess Jerusalem as the epicenter of Jewish state power, and increasingly being proposed as a potential capital of a global world order, a one world order, and then looking into the issues of these weaponized dialectics. I've talked about the idea maybe of Jewish power pincher moves, where you have this idea of maybe the more left-oriented Jewish power pincher move, which includes the domestic politics of more open borders and what might be described as cultural Marxism. And it's not limited to the United States of America. It's very much at play in Europe and even to the East. But then you have the right wing, we might call it, of the Jewish power dialectic that's very much related to this Zionism with this religious overtone to it, and we might even call something like cultural fascism that's at play not only in the United States of America but also in Europe. And in a certain way, we could suspect that there could be a carrot and a stick operation continuing to be applied against the Iranian government and the Iranian people in terms of, do you want to be destabilized and overthrown in some way, or do you want to join, you want a seat at the table in terms of the potential transfer of the power of global government to Tel Aviv? And that we've learned about this idea of the Talpiot Program from activist Brendan O'Connell, who's been putting it forth for a long time, that is this idea of the long-term strategic planning of Israeli military intelligence that was proposed in the wake of heavy Israeli losses in the Yom Kippur War, but that it's then also teamed up again with that's sort of the secular materialistic force that's then teamed up with this intense Chabad flavor, the Third Temple, the infantile theology that you described that had been basically orchestrated through the Scofield Bible, that God is some type of real estate agent that promises the Jews, indigenous land, no matter what they do, and it's being brought into some type of fusion. But I do want to just touch on what the important background that you brought up, James, about Iran, because not only does it point to what every leader in the world, what even human beings, individual human beings should know by now, is that if you get in bed with the U.S., aspects of the U.S. national security establishment, most specifically aspects of the clandestine services, covert operations around the CIA, and you become their made man, whether you're Saddam Hussein or whether you're the Shah, expect for you to be thrown under the bus at some point. And usually you're going to be thrown under the bus when you begin to assert just a wee bit of nationalism, sovereignty.
Gaddafi could very well have fit that description as well.
Yes, and I do think it is important for us to begin to look at that. As you pointed out, James, it's sort of like become, everybody's aware of the first big CIA coup, the 53, and the overthrow of Mossadegh. But more and more, the background is that 79 in Iran was also a CIA coup of some sort. And like you pointed out, is that the Shah was increasingly beginning to buck his masters, showing increasing nationalism. Yes, of course, he still had the Savak, which the CIA helped him establish in many ways. But he was also, the Bush CIA was becoming aware that he was, I think there was a sense that he had cancer. And so there was a lot of reasons to replace him. And I just wanted to add one source on this that I've brought up on our show before is Harry Martin's article the real Iran hostage crisis, a CIA covert op from the files of Farah Mansour, who is an Iranian, an American of Iranian background from the Los Angeles area, who pieced a lot of this together and hooked it directly into the core of the Bush CIA, where, as you pointed out, that as Khomeini was brought in, from Paris, by the way, right? That he was then there was mass assassinations, and it's put forth that those assassination lists, most focused in terms of things like his rivals, but also leftists and students who could become a threat, were supplied by this aspect of the Bush CIA. And so that this whole idea of the October surprise, and that it was all just about the holding of the hostages until Reagan came into office, is not the whole story. It looks like the entirety of the event was in many ways staged by the Bush CIA, and in many ways you could see it as a end pieces of the so-called war on terror, the Iranian hostage situation and 9/11, and the long-term TV playing out of the hostages was really the bringing into American consciousness of this idea of the terrorist threat from towards the Middle East. So then, whether the questions of whether there's been blowback and whether that the current Iranian government has broken away from their original patrons is a different question. But maybe we could explore a little bit of this dynamic in terms of the shift from the unipolar moment that the Project for New American Century paleo-neocons salivated over and utilized September 11th to basically in a way to try to solidify the position of the United States security apparatus as the hegemon, the unipolar hegemon of the world, slipping away in many ways, most obviously in the bringing in of this Trump administration and the deep connections to the Russian aspects of Russian intelligence, but most obviously through the Jewish Russian mob ties that tie most obviously into to Israel, and that there's a shift going on now that's very delicate that sort of pops up every so often in pieces of the press from this unipolar moment to what's being titled a multipolar moment that, of course, looks good to all of the people around the world who've been under the gun, literally, of the U.S. hegemon for decades and decades and decades and decades. But when you really look at it as a potential shift of power to Tel Aviv as the Israeli military intelligence corps, and Jerusalem, the religious military and Jewish military intelligence corps, as the potential new capital of world government, then there's a lot of danger that's being put on the table in relationship to the Chinese-Israeli relationship, the Russian-Israeli relationship, the One Belt, One Road initiative, where Iran is being brought into the fold, where Southeast Asia is being brought into the fold, and of course it's all down to the carrot and the stick, and of the old way of the mob deal you can't refuse. Do you want the silver or do you want the lead?
First of all, I'd never heard of this article by Harry Martin on the Iran hostage crisis. I've made a note of that. I'm going to definitely look it up. I'm definitely learning from you guys as we go along now, and I think you're probably right. That was the first perception by the American people of these Muslim extremists, TV extremists, as being the enemy. And one thing I noticed was during the 80s how much Islamic extremists were portrayed by Hollywood as the enemy. You had Back to the Future with the Muslim terrorist, machine gunning Doc in the parking lot, and there were a whole bunch of movies then that began to portray, Chuck Norris and Lee Marvin made a movie where the Muslims, terrorists invade America. I can't remember the name of it.
Was it the Delta Force, which was actually
yeah.
filmed largely in Israel? Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know it filmed partly in Israel. I have never really explored. To tell you the truth, I never watched that movie. I just read about it. But
Chuck Norris is supposed to be affiliated with the people at WorldNet Daily. So.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, anyway, they were kind of building up that image, and I thought it was ironic that, Doc says, "Great Scott, it's the Libyans." This is 1985, and very next year, 1986, Reagan bombs Libya. He bombs Tripoli over what was really a Mossad ruse. Victor Ostrovsky explained it, that there was this bomb that went off in La Belle discotheque in Germany, killing and wounded a number of American GIs. And then the Mossad had planted a transmitter called a Trojan in Tripoli, which sent out congratulations. The Americans picked that up on their listening stations and thought that Libya was behind the bombing of the discotheque. So Reagan bombed Libya based on a Mossad deception. That was the first blow of the war on terror. And I've written an article called "Did the Cold War End so the War on Terror could begin?" Because I noticed that just as soon as Gorbachev came to power and the Cold War dissipated, apparently because the time had come for the war on Islam, and in order for that to take place, you had to eliminate communism as the perceived enemy in order to keep the military establishment going and to focus now on the Middle East. And so there's a real process there, really beginning in 79, I think.
And by the way, James, in terms of that point that you made about the 86, the planting by Israeli intelligence of the sort of fake transmitters in Libya that then gets picked up by the NSA, it looks like there was a replication of that MO in the 2013 Ghouta false flag in Syria, where the Israeli military intelligence had planted these boulders that were actually transmitters that were then sending out signals for it to be blamed on the Syrian government, I believe.
Oh, I'd not heard that. I only knew about the video that so which year are we talking about now?
2013.
Oh, 2013. I was thinking of the more recent Trump bombing after the Ghouta, alleged Ghouta chemical weapons attack. But I didn't know that the Israelis had planted transmitters for that operation. It seems powerful. Of course, I'm reminded, of course, that after 9/11, that when they said Osama bin Laden had done it, people said, "Well, what's the evidence?" And they said, "Well, we got intercepts." And I thought, that immediately made me think of, in retrospect, after I learned more, that this might have been just the sort of intercepts they picked up with the 1986 affair, and perhaps as well as the 2013 alleged chemical weapons attack.
Yes, that's an interesting point too, because part of this. Going back to where we ultimately started, I brought up this in Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, both being part of Sayeret Matkal. And if you look at Sayeret Matkal, and you've done a lot of explanation about Daniel Lewin too, James, in terms of his key, apparent place in the September 11th operation. And in many ways, he could be seen as potentially part of this Talpiot program. He helped start Akamai, a key corporate nodal point of the modern internet in terms of the distribution of information packets, and somehow a Sayeret Matkal officer or operative of some sort is on one of these hijacked planes. So that's pretty interesting. But then also Ehud Barak and Netanyahu. And if you look at Sayeret Matkal, it's not only Israeli special forces, there's also a strong reconnaissance aspect to it. And I think this is sort of is a part of the September 11th operation and the ongoing motive, not only the who, but the why of 9/11 and the war on terror, that has a very strong piece to it that has to do with things like the core of signals and intelligence, SIGINT, but increasingly cyber intelligence as being the core of intelligence operations around the world. And then so this idea of the cyber false flag, I think is going to become increasingly relevant in terms of the rise of cyber, as Netanyahu talked about at AIPAC just in the last months, and he was bragging so much on Israeli capacity in relationship to cyber and how Israel is punching thousands of times above its weight in terms of its 20% capture of the cybersecurity market. And I pointed out before that this second to last chapter in Naomi Klein's book about the shock doctrine in disaster capitalism, where she prominently leaves out the who does the shocking. But other than that, there's some interesting stuff in there. And the second to last chapter is Losing the Peace Incentive, and it talks about this very interesting evidentiary context right before September 11th of the crashing of the Israeli economy, similar in a certain way to our own .com bust here in the United States, but even more severe and more pervasive. And then the Israeli government put all of its chips into cyber and security, and then immediately after September 11th started building its brand as the cybersecurity mall to the world. So I would assert at some level that the long term, beyond the Oded Yinon plan and the clean break plans, which is in basically beginning to sort of close. It's basically heading towards mission accomplished, as W might have said, that the longer term motive was potentially to set up the Talpiot Program, Israeli military intelligence, to be the go-to operator in the world in terms of cyber, because the wars of the future, people who look into future war scenarios, a lot of it is in the realm of cyber, and we see Stuxnet, of course, targeted at Iran, some type of combo operation of the NSA and Unit 8200 in Israel, and in many ways, there's actually the film 0 Days, I think it's called, shows that the NSA was very angry at the Israelis for making it more viral, Stuxnet, and it infecting more worldwide industrial sectors, and that what we see in terms of this threat, if you take Stuxnet as an example, is that Israeli military intelligence, Unit 8200, the Talpiot Program, including all of the spying that was done, Jonathan Pollard, and the structural transfer of U.S. technology into Israel and then out even to their other partners, including predominantly in China, is basically just to put Israel in the center of a carrot and stick operation where they can offer you the so-called security. As we see, Israel has said that they were the ones who caught this alleged Iranian terrorist threat against the MEK and Bolton and Giuliani in Paris, I believe. That sounds like, we caught ourselves again somehow. And then the stick, meaning we can kill switch diplomacy. We can turn off your power grid. We can turn off your water technology. So this is increasingly, I think, some of the what's at stake in relationship to the integration of the global economy and what's being offered as a carrot to such actors as Iran and Africa and Southeast Asia and the rest of the world, really.
Right, and with so much of the world dependent on cyber technology, losing that, the threat of losing that could certainly be used as a stick, with the technology itself, I guess, is the carrot. But with the 9/11, of course, the Israelis were providing so much technology, so much software, the P-Tech and MITRE Corporation providing technology to the armed services and the FAA and the FBI, and it's my understanding that I guess there was the Converse Corporation had provided the wiretap technology the FBI was using, so the Israelis always knew who was being wiretapped because they had the backdoor into that, and they also had a backdoor into our phone system through another company, and so it's quick.
I believe that Trump actually the Trump administration pardoned the head of Converse, Kobe Alexander. Is that right, Jeremy?
Oh, I think you're right. Yeah.
Among others, prominent Zionists such as the Kosher Slaughterhouse King and
Rubushkin
and Scooter Libby, and even talk of pardoning Michael Milkins, though.
Yeah, I got to ask you guys. I'm learning so much from you guys myself on the show. Stuxnet. How do you spell that? It's the first I've heard of it. Stuxnet.
Stuxnet. And I guess that's the lay name for it. It was caught by by some corporate security analysts, and that's what they named it. It probably has another covert name to it.
Right. And did I'll look that up. And did I understand you to say that there's sort of a economic downfall in Israel prior to 9/11 that maybe that event pulled them out of? Is that what you were saying, that there was something like, you said something comparable to the dot-com collapse that had been happening prior to 9/11?
Yes, exactly that, and more severe.
Yeah. Okay. Also, in addition to that, there's the element of Israel was going very as far as under some of the administrations of the 90s, such as the assassinated Rabin was going more in a more of a liberal Zionist direction, willing to make more concessions to Palestinians. Of course, that doesn't mean that obviously continued oppression of Palestinians took place during that period, obviously. But even then, you had this what we stumbled upon, Jeremy, the mega group, and some of these prominent American Jewish Zionist billionaires played a key role in helping Ariel Sharon to get elected in February of 2001, and then, of course, his support for some of the more hardline policies in September 11th followed not too long after that. So in some ways, that almost may have been a coup in some ways, a subtle coup. I don't know for sure, but...
Yes.
You guys are extremely well informed, and I'd love to do a show on 9/11 with you guys sometime. I'm actually working on a book on 9/11, but it's a very complex affair, and my goal has been, one of them delaying on this book is that I always find that I keep making mistakes and following a wrong theory and having to correct myself. And before I ever publish it, I want to make sure I've got it straight. But you guys seem to have some tremendous insights into what's been going on in Israel in some of these theaters of cyber operations I hadn't even heard of before.
Yes, that sounds good to do maybe a whole show on September 11th, because I've really appreciated the way I just really honor when people continue to make progress and don't get stuck on their own theory of something, that they continue to suss out the evidence and attempt to incorporate it into a larger theory that makes sense. It's very difficult to do in many ways because we get so attached to our own understanding. It's hard work to make intellectual progress sometimes, and so I honor the work that you've done a lot in that area.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you. It is very important to keep changing your mind according to the evidence. In fact, I wrote a post called 12 Angry Men in the Truth Movement. There's an old movie called 12 Angry Men. It's about a jury that where there's just one person thinks the accused is innocent, and in the course of the movie, it's all set in one room. One by one, the jurors realize that they're wrong, and that the evidence presented by a not so caring defense attorney they discover a lot of flaws, and then they start to review the evidence, and based on the evidence itself begin to change their minds. And it's very important that we take that jury-like attitude, that we're here not to stick with one theory or one idea, but to go with the way the evidence goes. And it's like Thomas Edison with a light bulb. You get it wrong one time, you go in a different direction until you get it right. And that's what I've been trying to do with 9/11. It's been relatively easy with things like Pearl Harbor and the Lusitania, which are more distant and we've had more time to vet. But 9/11, there's still a lot of questions about how that operation took place, and of course a lot of competing theories.
Yeah. I would say regarding Iran here, and you mentioned that Iran is, in your view, may have been the first step of the Arab Spring, and I think that's very interesting because 1979 in general was a very important year as far as the drafting of the modern war on terror. Of course, that was the year that the Soviet-Afghanistan war began, which was where Brzezinski, under Carter, armed the Afghan militias, which went on to become Al-Qaeda. Of course, Osama bin Laden was at the head of that, and of course, bin Laden was another person who was eventually used as a boogeyman, and later obviously taken out. More likely not in 2011, as conventional wisdom would have people believe. But anyway, and also this was the year that Christopher Berlin documented the meeting. Was it the Jonathan Netanyahu Institute after Benjamin Netanyahu's brother that died in the Entebbe raid in '76, where a number of people, including George H.W. Bush, attended this conference in Jerusalem where Berlin starts. So this was a lot of the modern-day foundation for the war on terror comes from this. So 1979, a key year of revolution, should probably be looked at in regards to, in 1917 or in 1848 as a very important year. But also, I'll say about Iran is that it's so black and white. It's so hard to make sense of what's going on. I mean, it really isn't easy. It's not a simple thing to make sense of. But I think the Iranian Revolution and the language, and a lot of people I'm sure agree with the Iranian sentiments, at least from a symbolic perspective, death to America, death to Israel. I mean, not literal death of people, but death to these at least criminal entities in their current forms. But a lot of that sometimes will come off as the meat that's used to justify having these radical or very strong anti-Islam in general views. And of course, our friend Brendan O'Connell is the controversial view in the alternative media asserts that Iran, but also believes that in a lot of ways that Hezbollah might be one of those type of deliberately set up boogeyman. Another topic for another day. But in that context, Iran would fit that. In some ways, you could say that the Ayatollahs and the mullahs do fit that perspective. But as far as current actions against Iran, I really don't know. And I will say if there's any type of serious regime change efforts going on in Iran, and on the surface, all the evidence would point in that direction. Everything from Trump entering the campaign saying that he was going to, the Iran deal was the worst deal in history, to, the Giulianis and the Boltons and people like Mike Pompeo, the longtime hawks on Iran. I mean, John Bolton was so hawkish on both Iran and Israel that it created conflict within the Bush administration, that he was a pariah in many ways within elements of the Bush administration. Bolton has said that the Iranian, or that basically the Bush administration in the last couple of years, that the faction that really wanted to take action on Iran lost in the last couple of years of the Bush administration. So you have all this saber rattling. I think it needs to be taken very seriously. But I'm also open to this. Jeremy said the carrot and the stick approach. Shayan Zarin, an Iranian American, wrote an article about pushing Iran into perhaps this into the world community, and that might be the goal of a lot of what you're seeing with Iran right now. And our friends at Talpiot Talk, Joseph Davis and others have we've talked quite extensively about what possibly could be going on in Iran, taking different perspectives into mind. But I do think if there is any type of serious action, it's not going to be a physical military war. It's going to be, the implementation of sanctions, which would cripple the economy, and then fomenting of mass chaos in the streets. And I think you could see this Arab coalition with countries such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Israel, along with the Trump administration, against Iran, and people like Eric Prince, the Blackwater mercenaries, playing a key role in fomenting these, creating these connections. And Prince could very well could create chaos in Iran in that direction. So I do think that if we see any type of serious action against Iran, it's going to be more economic and more the fomenting of domestic chaos rather than any type of military operation. But I'm open to different perspectives on what's happening with Iran because it's very complicated. But I think people need to remain very concerned about a lot of the rhetoric and where we're headed. And of course, Trump has now said that he's willing to meet with Rouhani with no preconditions. I don't know what that would lead to, but just in general, I would remain very much on guard and watching, and very much keeping up with things going on with Iran, because that, we could be leading to some type of major action taking place. And while it wouldn't be, I don't think, a military conflict, it would still be, American elements, criminal acts in this country. So we should very much keep our eyes on this, because this is a very important, a lot of ways, epicenter. And if we're to take the Trump people at face value, then yeah, they're very much determined to the very least, maybe destroy the country from within, if not all out overt regime change.
Yeah, we do have to keep our eyes completely wide open in relationship to the threat of that kind of potential of a destabilization effort, because look what has happened in Syria the Syrian people, which is another, similarly to Iran and the Persian people, and how dignified their culture is in many ways, and how integrative it is in relationship to their own nationality. Syria is very similar, and even maybe even more diverse in many ways, and holds it together, and really honors and respects in many ways the deep traditions of the many different ethnicities and religions represented in Syria, and what we've seen from the people who facilitated this, what looks to have been outlined in things like Oded Yinon and Clean Break, is basically a destabilization operation that has killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced millions. And so that is a threat that I think is potentially on the table, and that very much plays into the recent Helsinki meeting and what were Trump and Putin discussing behind the scenes. It did look like the singular leader in the entire world that was just beaming about it was Netanyahu.
It was, Jeremy, it was to the point where Trump, in his interview with Tucker Carlson, when he was asked about Putin and Syria, Trump instead brought up Netanyahu and how devoted, they are to Israel's interest in Syria. So.
Yeah, and Trump was very much touting how that was front and center, was Israeli security was the main thing on the table in many ways. And then one other thing I wanted to bring up, I do think this year of 1979 is a crucial one to begin to analyze and maybe construct in an analytical way as an opening gambit or a key year in this what's become the terror wars. And because the Jerusalem conference, not only Iranian Revolution and all the machinations behind that, but the Jerusalem conference and Netanyahu's role in that, and bringing together all of the who's who of the national security establishments of the U.S. and the UK. But then also in my presentation about Unit 8200 and Talpiot, I put forth also that it's the year that Shaul Eisenberg, a key member of the Israeli national security establishment, economic establishment, I believe he's probably Mossad. He brought a plane, it was actually a covert trip of a high-level Israeli military and intelligence people to China. And it was kept a secret for a long, long time because of the delicateness of it. But I really think it was the opening in many ways of what's becoming very obvious in the mainstream press globally right now in terms of the marriage of Chinese capacity with Israeli technology. And that's just becoming more and more obvious as we see. But the other thing that happened in that year was that Yosef Bodansky, who's still around in the U.S. national security establishment, he goes from working as the technical editor of the Israeli Air Force magazine and a pretty obvious member of what's known as Lakam, the Israeli Technical Intelligence or the Bureau of Scientific Transfer or something like that. I can't remember how it was started back in the 50s by Shimon Peres, actually in the development of the Israeli nuclear capacity in relationship to the French. And there's a whole interesting story in the back there. But Yosef Bodansky goes from being technical editor of the Israeli Air Force magazine, and he's showing up in the United States and becomes the technical editor of JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and then ultimately helps set up what's known as the Technology Transfer branch under the DoD even. And so that actually has created, there's an institutionalization of this technology transfer operation that's at the core of this long-term Israeli military intelligence stratagem that's also very obvious in relationship to 1979 and Shaul Eisenberg to China and Yosef Bodansky to the United States of America. And then just that he also then pops up again right immediately after that in this whole whole Jonathan Pollard affair, where people can go look at some of there is some very good writing from that era from some of the LaRouche people about they called the Soviet-Israeli cell that's writing Reagan's foreign Soviet policy. And you begin to see that the Jonathan Pollard spy ring he was only the tip of the iceberg, and that the Israelis already had the file numbers for what they were looking for, and he just basically supplied it. So it meant that there was somebody probably even above him, someone in the realm of the Defense Policy Board, someone like Richard Pearl, or someone in the area of the Rand Corporation, someone like an Andrew Marshall, the Yoda of the U.S. military establishment, that had already been supplying these to the Israelis what to get. But then it also turned out that most of the information that Pollard got was most interesting to the Soviets. And you see some type of trade-off, that the Soviets did a large population transfer to Israel, and Israel gave the Soviets lots of deep U.S. National security secrets that included things like, people make a big deal about Edward Snowden and those leaks and all of that, but really the Pollard, there was whole, probably hundreds of people potentially who were targeted from the U.S. clandestine services, but then also entire national security agency protocols that had to be rewritten because they had been exposed by way of the Pollard cell that apparently is still in place in many ways, just as the Mega group is still in place.
Yeah. You guys have done yeoman study work here. I had myself had noted that the coincidence of the Shah's downfall in 1979 with that Jerusalem conference you're talking about, that does seem to be the nexus point. Wasn't that also when we recognized China?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
Yes,
1979 was a kind of a crucial year with Nicaragua, and there's just all kinds of things going on that year, and it just seemed that there was a paradigm shift, and it kind of came to fruition with Gorbachev, and then the war on terror beginning in the mid-'80s. And of course, it got into land war of 91 and just progressed over the years. And of course, with 9/11 be the critical pivot point. But I just want to commend you guys for how much you know about these affairs. Again, I've been taking notes on you as we've been doing this interview. There's so much information you guys have at your fingertips. So well done on all of that. You obviously are very informed, and I think you should have a lot more listeners.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for that and all of your work, and very much appreciate you joining us, and I hope we can do it again.
Oh, absolutely. It's been a real joy being out with you guys. I hadn't listened to your show before. You invited me on, and I know you guys had this wealth of information at hand. You guys are really very well versed, very well studied on what's going on. You really understand what's going on in Israel at a depth that I've rarely encountered before. So, it's been a real good time for me, and I hope that our listeners have enjoyed it and learned something as well.
Yep, indeed. Thank you.
All right. Any last words here for this show, either of you?
Well, I should just mention, I guess, my contact information. Maybe you guys are going to link to me anyway, but my website is jamesperloff.com, and it's P as in Peter, ERLOFF. I'm on Twitter. You gave this in the intro, didn't you? Okay. On Twitter is James Perloff, but I have a lot of articles there on the history of false flags and a whole breadth of history, alternative views of history, revisionist history. And I've also written my latest book, Truth is a Lonely Warrior, again, a primer on the New World Order, something that's footnoted and indexed, and it walks you right through. This is actually developed out of PowerPoint I used to do for civic groups and political groups, talking about the New World Order. It starts off with false flags, then moves into who really runs America, and then moves into the Fed, then moves into media control, and like that. And we go all the way through vaccines and weather control. So it's kind of a A to Z look at what's been going on. Hopefully something you give to a friend that will convince them who's a skeptic. But people listen to your show, they're going to be in good shape.
Well, that sounds like a great overview. I'd like to read your most recent book. It sounds very interesting, and we will link to your website, and we will link also to some of the articles that you've written that you've mentioned here too in the show notes.
Yeah, I'll link to you guys too. This has been great.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time and your work, James Perloff. And so I guess until next week, Antidote, we out.
Okay, right, thank you, Greg and Jeremy. Thank you so much.
All right.
God bless.